Hi, and welcome. I'm the Reverend Dr. Cheryl Gaver. I'm Presbyterian minister of 3 congregations in Eastern Ontario. And thank you for joining for this week's session on why so many denominations. How did we ever get from being one body of Christ to having over 44,000 denominations? So if this is your first week, you're welcome to join in and just check out the other videos. Quick review. In the first session, we were looking at basically from the time of Jesus to Constantine, so about 300 years. And many of the divisions that were emerging this time period were because they were arguing over who Jesus was and what was the relationship between the Jesus followers and Judaism, because especially at the beginning, Christianity wasn't a separate religion. In the second week, we traced the development of the church from the time of Constantine up to the Middle Ages. And we saw as the Roman Empire expanded, it ended up being split because it was just too large to govern. So you had the eastern half that was Greek and the western half that was Latin. The church did not split at that time, but those divisions did exist, and they would eventually lead to the church splitting in 1054 AD. But focusing on the West, as the Western Roman Empire collapsed, they brought back their armies from the different provinces. Well, Christians didn't just stop being Christians because the Romans were gone. So you had pockets of Christianity continuing, but they didn't have any ties to Rome. So again, they're sort of isolated. In week 3, we were tracing sort of from the Middle Ages up to the Reformation. So we were looking at factors like the Bible's in Latin, but people don't speak Latin. So how do you get the message across? And what is the impact that has, the long-term impact that it has on the church? And we saw some of the impact the Renaissance had and some of the other challenges, internal and external, until by the 16th century, the church is faced with a number of challenges and has to set priorities. Well, the Catholic Church set one set of priorities, but the Protestants set another, and those two were not compatible, and so you end up splitting the church. So the Protestants are protesting abuses, and they end up leaving. You get some broad strokes of what the Protestant Reformation was. There is the Catholic Reformation also. We don't talk about much about it, but they were aware of the problems, but they had a different priority system. So it took them longer to correct some of those abuses. Last week, we concentrated on the major branches that emerged from the Protestant Reformation: the Lutherans, the Anglicans or Church of England, the Reformed tradition, and the radical reformers as well. You'll hear a little bit more about them today. But we saw some of those movements, the Quakers, the Mennonites, that's part of the radical movements. And by the end of the Reformation, you had all sorts of denominations around, and they had slightly different beliefs, slightly different practices. So it seemed, okay, now we can go on with being Christian. But there were 2 questions that really hadn't been answered. One was, how do you live as a Christian? They've been so busy arguing over what you believe or how do you do communion or baptism or what else should you be doing here or there, that they were forgetting on how do you live as a Christian and how do you pass on your faith to others. So those were the 2 questions that challenged the church from the 17th century on, and they lead to today's topic of the revivals, the Great Awakenings. So at this point, I'm going to turn this over to the PowerPoints. Just a moment. Hi again. The religious revivals are primarily in American Christian history. This according to Wikipedia. But there are awakenings in England and other places too. It wasn't just an American movement. It is an evangelical Protestant ministry. So part of what that means is, in the Reformation, the Protestant goal was to show that the clergy were educated. They knew what they were talking about. Sermons tended to be very long, and they would often focus on what the Greek, or bring into the sermon what the Greek or the Hebrew meant and how that changed the text. Well, that may be great if you're dealing in academia and with other academic scholars, but it's not a great way to introduce the gospel to people who don't know what Christianity is. And so the evangelical ministers developed a different way of preaching. And it was focused on communication, is what I put. It's focused on how do you get that message across to people in a way that they hear it? How do you make it simple and clear that they say, this is what the Bible says, and this is how it applies to your life, and you got it. And that was, once people could get that, then more and more people became interested, and then it starts snowballing. The primary message in some of these awakenings is focusing on sin. Guilt, sin, we're sinners, we're sinful creatures, we need forgiveness, and that's Christ. So we need Christ because we're so bad. Okay, so as I said, it didn't start just in America. It started in England, at least the part that I'm talking about. And we had here a Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, started in 1698. The SPCK, they were saying, people need to read about it themselves. And so you had them publishing Christian books, not just the Bible, but other books written. And they're still around today. That's what they do. They'll publish many of the textbooks that seminary students use. They'll publish anything that's Christian because they want to get that message out there. Society for the Propagation of the Gospel was a missionary movement. And again, they're still around and they're still getting that gospel out there. You have what was called the New Light movement. It's like the first Great Awakening. Might have been called that in the States, but in Canada, England, other places, it was called the New Light movement. And that's in the Maritimes. In the States, 1730s, you had evangelical preachers like Whitefield. Methodism is the big denomination that emerges during the First Awakening. And it started by John and Charles Wesley. Now, Wesley, when they're in England, okay, they founded the Holy Club. It was committed to living holy life. They had different practices, okay? So this is, what it shows is their commitment, their dedication to living a Christian life and trying to figure out how to do it. So they go to Georgia in the States, and they're going to be ministers to the colonies, and they're also going to be missionaries to the indigenous people. They fail. It's not working. So they go back to England, and they end up connecting with the Moravians. Now, this group we haven't talked about before, they're, again, a Protestant group, and they actually emerged before the Protestant Reformation. They emerged in the 15th century in what is probably now Eastern Europe. And they connect also, while they're with the Moravians, that's when they have that evangelical conversion. They feel God's presence in their lives. And then they begin connecting with other evangelical movements, other evangelical preachers, and they start to develop a method of how to reach people, which is why they're sometimes referred to as Methodists. In England, they're referred to as Wesleyans because Wesley was their last name. So they're emphasizing piety, they're emphasizing missions, they're emphasizing music. We know them, whether or not you're a Methodist, we know John and Charles Wesley because the hymns that they wrote, there's so many of them in their hymn books. And look up the hymn book to find out some of those hymns. So characteristics of Methodism, they didn't start out to split from the church. They started out, people who go to church, they're getting educated in Christianity. What about all those who aren't going to church? How do we reach them? How do we reach the ones the church has neglected? And that's who the Wesleyans were going after. And then they would set up classes to teach. So you could share different things. You would confess your sins. People would forgive you. They would encourage you. And so you would gradually build up this Christian character, understanding Christianity. And it's sort of, I guess, the ancestry of Bible study classes even. In time, again, they're going to sort of go far enough away from the rest of the Church of England that they're going to be kicked out and start their own denomination. But that's later. This is at the start. Key beliefs: we're dead in sin. We're sinners by nature. We are guilty because of original sin. There is nothing we can do to save ourselves. We're justified by our faith. Faith produces inward and outward holiness. You can't just say the words, you have to live the life. And they reject the Reformed or Calvin's doctrine of predestination, which is basically that regardless of what you do, if you're in the book of life, you're going to go to heaven. And if you're not in the book of life, you're going to go to hell. That's predestination and double predestination. Foundation in Presbyterian fundamental foundation in Presbyterianism, not talked about as much nowadays. But Methodists didn't have that. And they're much more successful. Okay, once they've got that method, they've learned the things from other evangelicals, they just spread like wildfire throughout England, Ireland, Canada, the US. The Second Great Awakening is a little bit later, so probably around the American Revolution, and it continues to the 1850s. So mainly northern US and the Midwest. So as the Americans are moving into Ohio and those countries, they're bringing into this new revival, new energy, energized religion. And it's hellfire, damnation preaching, absolutely. You've got the Seventh-day Adventists are one of the groups that emerged from there, but you've also got the temperance movement, temperance league, no alcohol, especially in the territories, and abolition of slavery. Abolition of slavery and women's rights were fundamental with the Quakers. They began to permeate other denominations as well. One of the big things that come out of the American Revolution, nothing to do with religion, is just the names change. So once America is free from Great Britain, it doesn't want to be the church to be known as the Church of England. I mean, they just spent 7 years or so fighting the English to be free. They don't want the Church of England. So they renamed the Anglican Church the Episcopalian Church. The Wesleyan Church, because the Wesleyans were English after all, it gets renamed the Methodist Church. Now, Canada is still part of the British Empire. We don't have that problem. As far as I know, we don't have any Episcopalian churches in Canada. We have Church of England, Anglican. But we do have, or did have, both Wesleyan and Methodist churches. If the missionaries came from England, the churches were called Wesleyan. If the missionaries came from the US, they were called Methodist. So we ended up with two variations of essentially the same denomination. I'm going to focus now on England and the Clapham sect in the late 1780s up to the 1840s. And this was, again, as it says, prominent, wealthy evangelical Anglicans. And it was an organization or a club, and they had tremendous impact in a wide range of policies, as you can see from the list. Liberation of slaves, abolition of the slave trade. They helped set up the country of Sierra Leone in Africa. It was created as a place where freed slaves could go. And one of the first governors was a member of the Clapham sect. They also advocated the reform of the penal system, they were also, this proclamation society was proclaiming what a moral society should look like. So they were against immorality and in many forms. They advocated Sunday school. If you want to pass the gospel to the next generation, you're going to have to teach them. How do you teach them? And so they're going on with that. And once you're looking at how are you treating other people, then it begins, how do you treat animals? So yes, the Society for the SPCA comes out of it too. And the Clapham sect triggered founding of other missionary societies, such as the Christian Missionary Society. John Venn was one of the founders, and is like, what methods can we use more effectively to promote the knowledge of the gospel among the heathen? That's the main question. His son was one of the, as it says, foremost Protestant strategists, and he developed the sort of three selves for missionary work. And that was self-supporting, self-governing, self-extending. So churches should become self-supporting, and that would free up the missionary money to go to a new church. As the new church became self-governing, the missionary would be free to go elsewhere. And as it became self-expanding, you would get new missionaries being trained to go elsewhere. And it was a three-step process of how to build a church, get it going, and move on. The problem is we didn't do that. So Henry Venn saw the danger of having the church do too many things for the state. So what happened in Canada was the church decided to try to civilize people, not just teach Christianity, but to civilize them in British customs. Okay. Henry Venn said, don't interfere with the local power structures. Let the church assume the culture of that community. But what the missionaries in Canada often tried to do was bring in British Canadian culture and impose it on Indigenous cultures instead of letting it be the other way around. The danger of arrogance and hubris, once the missionaries had power, how do you get them to give up that power? And so we saw missionaries who refused to let Indigenous people be ordained or preach or be missionaries because they weren't white. So Henry Venn warned against it, and we did not listen. The Third Great Awakening is from the 1850s. So again, you're going to have that slavery movement in there to the 1900s, probably till 1914, 15, to World War I. And you're going to see some denominations, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses. They have very tenuous ties to Christianity, but, you know, they're claiming Jesus in some way. This is a period that's really profound, active missionary work, and that's going to continue throughout for quite a few more years, probably to the 1960s is when you're going to have that shift. So 1910 was a World Missionary Conference. It was huge, huge. All the Protestant denominations, not the Eastern Orthodox, not the Roman Catholics. The Anglican Catholics came, provided there was, you know, some wording was changed, because the Protestant evangelicals, you know, would often think the Catholics were one step away from hell. And that was not a good way to go if you wanted to bring in all the missionaries together to talk about missionary movements. And they wanted to evangelize the world, to Christianize the world in this generation. And so for if you've seen movies about the Inner Sixth Happiness, which is missionaries in India, the Black Robe, that's the Roman Catholic, Jesuits, missionaries in North America, There's others about missionaries in South America, missionaries in Africa, missionaries in India. You have different, missionary movements. This is sort of the big era. This is the impetus that we need to preach the gospel and get people converted. The other thing was the social gospel that comes out of there. And this is going to focus on the Canadian side more, but basically it's applying Christian ethics to social problems. Okay, it's using, like I said, Matthew 25. You're talking about the goats and the sheep. The goats go to hell, the sheep go to heaven. What is the dividing? It's not what they believe. It's, when I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick, you visited me. You guys didn't do it. It's how you are living your faith. And so the social gospel is, we need to live that faith. We need to apply Christian ethics to social problems. And so in 1910, perhaps at the missionary conference, they're saying, look, the great ends of the church, yes, we want to save humankind. We want salvation, but we also need to shelter, nurture, provide fellowship for God's people. We have to have the worship, hold on to the truth. We need social righteousness. We need to create the kingdom of heaven on earth as much as we can. And that means applying Christian principles. So get rid of child labor. Regulate work hours for mothers, if not for anyone else, but at least for mothers, and eventually that will expand. Get rid of, working 12 hours a day or 14 hours a day. Work on that relationship between employers and employees. You have an obligation or responsibility to one another. What's fair? And force schooling. If you want a way out of poverty, you have to have education. So let's get everyone in school, not just those who can afford it. And there you have the beginning of your public school system. In Canada, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, that eventually became the NDP, was founded in part on gospel principles by J.S. Wordsworth. He's a Methodist minister. So our New Democratic Party, which some people, which is very socialist in many ways, is founded by a Methodist minister who's committed to building the kingdom of God here and now. It finally comes to power in 1944. It's led by Tommy Douglas, who is a Baptist minister. So again, you've got this Christian component. We need to put it into practice. What is the things that Tommy Douglas emphasizes? Universal health care. If you're sick, you should be treated. You shouldn't have to worry about how are you going to pay for the treatment. Family allowance, old age pension. 3 fundamental policies that are now basic to the Canadian identity, and they come out of the social gospel. Now, the NDP has moved past a lot of its religious orientations. It is much more secular, and yet the NDP's previous leader, they just elected a new one, was Elizabeth May, who used to be a minister. So again, it's that social gospel of putting Christian ethics into practice to transform the world is that basis for many of Canada's social programs. And then in the 20th and 21st century, what we see this social gospel is in the United Church and the Anglican churches, which is a little different than you might expect. Okay, so here's our sort of map, simplified map of denominations. We see that split in 1054 of the Orthodox Church in the East and the Catholic Church in the West that eventually becomes the Roman Catholics. We see the Protestant Reformation here with the Lutherans, eventually going into the Calvinists, with the Anglicans, and the cross-feeding that we saw. This is the radical movement that lead into the Anabaptists, the Mennonites, Amish, and you'll see branches into Quakers and things. And then we've got, here it has Congregationalists and Baptists emerging. And then we've got the Methodists. So that's the first awakening. We're going to have the African Methodists, eventually Salvation Army. It comes out here, Church of the Nazarene. We'll see Church of Christ, Adventists, others. Pentecostals will come out too. We'll focus on them later though. But what you see with some of these denominations is they're taking a chunk. They're saying, who's being neglected? Let's reach those people. Okay, but of course, just because we've solved problems of beliefs and practices and priorities doesn't mean we don't have differences. And we kept splitting and splitting. I'm focusing on the Presbyterian Church because you don't want to be here for hours. Okay, so again, this is very high level divisions. And I'm going to stop the share, I think. High level, excuse me, I think I just lost my screen here. Just a minute. Okay, so we saw in the one awakening, the first awakening, there was the New Light movement. So you had the Old Light and the New Light churches in the Maritimes and other places. And so they're each building their own church, and they're not talking to each other. Another division was the burgher and the anti-burgher. And this one is a little bit more interesting. If you become a politician, you have to take an oath of office. Well, the oath of office in the old days was also that you would be standing up and preserving or protecting the religion of the realm, so the official religion. Well, the religion of the realm in England is the Church of England. Presbyterians were not members of the Church of England. So how could you take that oath in good conscience? Those became the anti-burghers. You could not be elected to a member of parliament or anything like that. The others were saying, well, that oath of the religion of the office, well, it's Christianity, and yes, you can. So you had that division, burgher and anti-burgher. You also had the free church. And again, it's going to have different issues in different regions. In Ireland, it was basically fundamentalist, evangelist. We're going to emphasize the truth. We're emphasizing this. We're going to be separate. We don't want to be ecumenical. We don't want to talk with the others. If they're straying from the word of God, we're not going to deal with them. We're going to be our own person or our own congregation. In the States, it was much more of an anti-slavery focus. So the free church is free. You know, blacks are free. You don't have slaves. One of the later issues that emerged in, I think it was in Toronto, was whether you would have an organ in a church. Do you use organ or piano in a church service? And the whole thing is, it's the same question. Is that music going to enhance worship, or is it going to take you away from focusing on God and allowing you to clap because the music's so good? The music is taking you not to worship, but to somewhere else. And if it's somewhere else, then it's bad and shouldn't be in church. So this is some of that divide. And it gets pretty scary at times. Let me show you what I mean. This is in the States, it looks like. And so you have the Presbytery, the old side, the new side, USA, old school, new school, Welsh Calvinistic, Orthodox Presbyterian, Bible Presbyterian, Evangelical Presbyterian, Cumberland Presbyterian, Second Cumberland Presbyterian, Old Light, New Light, something of the South, United Presbyterian. So wham, they're all sort of splitting, and then notice they're coming together. The same thing is going to happen in Canada, but this is why. So up until, I've given the clue away, 1854, Canada rejects the state church. Okay, in England, You had a state church, Church of England. The government collects taxes from people, and some of those taxes are used to support the church. So the government pays the churches, supports the church buildings, everything, grounds, and pays the clergy salaries. People don't have to. The low and radical churches, because they were usually oppressed by the state, they certainly were not supported by the state. So if you want your own minister, you're going to have to find the money to pay them yourself. If you want your own church, you have to find the money for yourself. So they have no money from the government, and they're supported by members. In Canada, we were in a very difficult situation. What was the official religion? In Quebec, it's Roman Catholics. Roman Catholics outnumber the Protestants. For most of the rest of Canada, it's mainly Anglicans, Church of England. But if you were from Scotland, chances are it was Presbyterian or Roman Catholic, but Presbyterians. So the government has all this land to go to churches and all this money to go to churches, but which church should get it? And so, of course, the three are saying you should get it to us. Well, if you're going to give it to the Presbyterians, you might as well give it to the Methodists and Wesleyans and the Baptists and some of these other denominations. And at that point, Canada in 1854 just says, forget it, forget it. So it does distribute it. It comes up with some scheme to distribute the church land that it has. It stops collecting money for the churches. And now suddenly all the churches in Canada, regardless of denomination, are treated like low and radical. They don't get money from the government, and members have to contribute. So you've sometimes wondered, why does the church ask for so much money? Well, you got salaries to pay and you got a building. So if you want that building to be, the driveway to be repaved or parking lot to be repaved, who's going to pay for it? It's got to be you. So once you have no state religion, and also realize the population can't support all those churches, and some of those issues die out. You don't need burger and anti-burger because there is no official religion. You don't have to have the free and not free or whatever. So here's burger and anti-burger, and they start joining together, and then they join with the Synod of Nova Scotia. They're going to associate with Church of Scotland. This one will start saying, well, no, we're strong enough, we can have our own church, United Presbyterian. And so you start getting unions. And in 1875, the Presbyterian Church in Canada is created. So all those different divisions come together. Though you still have a few free Presbyterians around, I believe. Here's another example. The free churches are coming in, and they're all coming together as this. The same thing is happening in the other denominations. In 1874, you get the Methodist Church of Canada. 1893 is the Anglican Church of Canada. So you're coming together, and you find that some of the towns, they just can't afford 3 or 4 or 5 church buildings, church clergy. They each want their own. And really are some of the differences that drastic. And if you're focused, if you have common beliefs and all that you're differing is your priority of what you do, how you do it here and how you do it there. So we start seeing times for congregations to come together. So 1925 is a big date in, excuse me, Canadian Protestant history. The Methodist Church, the Congregationalist Church was another of these smaller denominations, and the Presbyterian Church voted to join together and create the United Church of Canada. 1/3 of the Presbyterians said no. They said, if you're going to go the Methodist route, you're going to start focusing so much on the social dimension how you live your gospel that you forget what you believe. And that's exactly what's happened in the United Church, that they've become a social gospel church. And you'll find, do they believe the Bible? And a lot more debate around it. There's been a number of other church unions that have failed. The United Church tried to join with the Anglican Church, I believe. Yes, and for a while they shared a common hymn book. Then the Anglican Church tried to join with the Lutheran Church. And so some of these, they failed, and yet they haven't. They tried it out. They found their differences were too big, especially differences in worship. People didn't want to change how they worshiped. So what eventually emerged was, instead of joining together to create new united churches of different kinds, we'll stay individual, but surely we can collaborate on common endeavors. And so Kairos is one of these common endeavors, working with social missions around the world. You'll find with PWS&D, which is the Presbyterian World Service and Development, or Primates World Service and Development, if you're Anglican. And that's just, how do we do our missionary work? And we're trying to reach and help, and we'll have education, medical, anti-poverty issues. There's a lot where we can collaborate. World Council of Churches is another thing that comes out eventually after World War II. And again, we've now got more community churches, because again, they're saying these divisions are so crazy. The denominational doctrine doesn't matter to us as much. We want something else. And so you start getting community churches, and again, there'll be a large variety, and more about them later as we're dealing with closer to the present. So that brings us up to we've got all these sort of holiness churches. Pentecostalism is beginning, Lutherans, Reformed, Mennonite. So we start seeing how we spread more and more. And that's it for today. Thank you. And next week, the challenges where we start seeing church declines. Take care. And once again, it's Reverend Dr. Cheryl. Thank you for joining. Bye-bye.